Hello, guys. Welcome to RoboSapien podcast. Yeah, man, we have never talked about this issue that we are going to talk about today, right? Right. There's this very underrated issue that we are going to talk about today. Yeah, that the founder's mental health and the awareness about it is very rare to find anywhere on the YouTube because people don't think that is required, right? Right. So everyone thinks that the founders they just do whatever they do. Yeah, and they don't have a mental state themselves. Yeah, and I think our guest today, Dr. Jennie Byrne, is going to make a very very big impact as this topic, as she is the expert and she has studied about this topic and like she has placed herself to. Yeah, and she is a founder of many different companies. So her perspective is not going to be biased like most of the doctors' podcasts that we see online. So, but then her perspective will also be like inclined towards the startup founders' perspective. Yeah. So I think it is going to be really fruitful. So let's see and enjoy.
Hello, Dr. Jennie Byrne. Welcome to the RoboSapien podcast. We are so excited for this particular episode, not just because we are talking about the mental health, but also because we are going to talk about neuroscience and the brain and behavior pattern. And since I have been introduced to, deep learning, I've been interested in neural networks and how the neural patterns work, how our brain affects everything that goes on around us and our whole body, whole functioning, and whole behavior of us. So we are very excited to learn everything about that from you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. This should be fun.
Yes. Yeah. So, doctor, can you please quickly explain to our audience what does a brain and behavior expert do? And because I'm pretty sure most of the people must have heard about the psychiatrist, but they do not know what an actual brain and behavior expert does.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different people who study brain and behavior. So for me, I'm pretty obsessed with all things brain and behavior. That was really just been my passion since I was probably about 20 years old. And I've pursued it in a couple ways. So I'm a psychiatrist, and a psychiatrist is a medical doctor who goes through medical school and training and then focuses on the way our brain and behavior manifests. And I also did a PhD. So like you, I was, pretty nerdy. I did a PhD in neurophysiology, and that's where you really study the brain at a deeper level. In my case, I was looking at individual brain cells and recording electrical activity from the brain. So that was my training. And then I went on in my career to do clinical practice. So that's where I saw patients who would come into me with mental health concerns or substance use problems. And, for more than 15 years, I've worked with individual patients. And I do both medicine. So sometimes I'll prescribe them a medicine if that's what's the best treatment for them. Or sometimes I don't prescribe a medicine and I'll do talk therapy or psychotherapy. Or sometimes I'll do both. So I've been this really interesting career where I get to kind of see the brain and behavior from all these different angles. And then working in big organizations and seeing how that plays out kind of in the more corporate setting. How does human brain and behavior play out in these very kind of corporate business structures as well?
Yeah, nice. So, as you said, you have worked in multiple sectors. So, in your career as a doctor, have you ever encountered people as a founder of startups?
Yeah. So I've kind of had experience with startup founders in two ways. Mm-hmm. In my clinical practice, I had patients come to me who were startup founders, people who were highly successful individuals in their career, but they were struggling. And whether that was with anxiety or depression or sometimes ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they struggled too. Sometimes on the surface, everything looked great, but underneath things weren't so great. And so I worked with them clinically. And then in a separate path, when I work in organizations, I've been an executive, I've been a co-founder, I've done a startup. So I can really relate to a lot of what they go through in the business setting. And I really enjoy working with other startups and co-founders just more in an executive role, because I also really understand the psychology of what that takes. And, the good and bad, some of it's good, some of it's not so good. And I think I've been able to help other founders and other startup executives because I've also had that lived experience myself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it gives you a key advantage to have knowledge of all these things, because I think that the mental health of a founder is something that we do not talk about a lot in the whole startup world, in the whole, startup genre right now.
Yeah.
And that is something which concerns me a lot, because I've seen a lot of my friends who started their own company nowadays, some of them were seniors, some of them were super seniors of my college. They started their own company and they faced a lot of burnout and a lot of anxiety and depression. So what is the one factor that you found most common in the founders specifically, and founders or people who are working in startups?
Oh gosh, a couple things. I mean, a lot of founders like me are kind of futurists. So being a futurist, you're typically looking ahead to the future. You really want to create something for the future. And so sometimes living in the future makes you shortchange the present day. So you're always like, well, in the future, it'll be this, or I'm building this company in 5 years, it's going to be this. And so I just got to get through this. So there's this dialogue that a lot of us have inside, which is, I just have to get through this thing and then I'll rest. And especially in startup culture, there's this hustle culture, right? There's all these stories about successful startups that were very hustle oriented, where people slept under their desk and didn't leave the building and did all these things and shortchanged their own brain and body because they had this future goal. So one thing I see very commonly is this idea of like, well, I just have to get to this point. So in the meantime, I can not sleep and eat poorly and not take care of myself and ignore people around me and get rid of my social relationships. And then I'll just get to the finish line and it'll all be better. So I see that psychology happen a lot. And obviously you can maintain that for a period of time. And if you're young, maybe you can maintain that a little longer than someone like me who's a little older. But eventually that's really going to be harmful to your brain and your body. And maybe you get to the finish line and you recover and you rest. But what I see with most founders is they don't rest because that's not their temperament. So they get to the finish line, maybe they take a couple months off, but then they're kind of itching to go back. And then they just repeat the cycle over and over again. And then I've even seen with startup founders who are a little older, who have been successful, where they do get to the end and maybe they're middle-aged and they're like, okay, it's time for me to cash out and live the good life. And then they look around and they're like, I don't have any relationships. I don't have any hobbies. I don't have anything. And then they feel very empty and can actually get profoundly depressed. So I'm not meaning to paint such a grim picture, but I do want to emphasize that I think startup founders are particularly prone to this hustle that never ends. And I don't think it's very good for your mental health, but you're right. We don't really talk about it.
Yeah, I think that happens a lot, that when they reach to a finish boundary extends again. Then they are reaching for some other goal, then they are reaching for some other goal, and that finish never happens. They never reach to the finish line, and they eventually burn out.
Yeah, it's in their nature, right? That's the whole point of being a futurist and building things. You like to always be getting to the next goal. So I think that's part of what the DNA of many founders.
Yeah, right. So as you have also experienced it from your point of view, so what do you think? This hustle culture that all the startups emphasis on, should it be there or not? Is it good or not?
I love that question. I think, the answer is always it depends, right? But here's what I think. Hustle culture is a type of culture. there are other workplace cultures that can exist, but hustle culture has become the one that most people expect. And we make a lot of assumptions that we need to be in hustle culture to be successful. But if we take a step or two back and we're like, where do these assumptions come from? And how are they impacting our brain? Is that really the best way for our brains to work? Most of the time, for most people, when you take a couple steps back, you'll be like, that hustle culture isn't really optimal for the way my brain should work or my colleagues. And it's just a culture. And I'm just assuming that I have to be, texting and slacking and emailing endlessly all day long, all night long. Like, that's an assumption because that's what I see around me. But that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be that way. It's just an assumption.
That's totally true. That is totally true, because I think it has been told to us since we were really small kids, that if you
Right.
do a lot of work, if you put a lot of effort in something, you will succeed in it. That's not necessarily true, because you have to put a lot of effort eventually, but you don't have to, burn yourself into making that thing happen. Because what will you achieve if by the end you are all exhausted?
And I can say my experience was when I grew up, I was told to work hard. And that was a big thing in my family and growing up, work hard. And I did. I worked really hard and I got a lot of degrees on my wall. But I didn't really make leaps in my work and my career until I started working smarter instead of working harder. And I'll tell you what I mean. So, for me to sit down and look at a little box all day long and just be busy and do emails and, I could do that. I was good at that. I figured it out, but I wasn't making leaps. I was kind of just moving along, making little, promotions or whatever. But the leaps really came when I wasn't sitting at the desk. So when I had my business, I had a practice for about 9 years. I solopreneured it and then I sold it. The leaps came when I stopped working. So I had this weird thing happen where somebody challenged me. They said, I dare you to do a 4-week vacation. There's a book about it called The 4-Week Vacation for people who have small businesses. I dare you to do this. And when you come back, your business is going to be better and you're going to be better if you don't touch it for 4 weeks. And I thought, that is insane. Like, there's no way if I'm not here for 4 weeks that the business is going to be better without me. What are you talking about? But I don't know. I kind of like the idea of the challenge. I always kind of like people give me challenges. So I was like, okay, I'll try this. And I did it. And it was amazing. The business got better because I wasn't there fixing every single little problem. They had to fix things and they made some mistakes, but they weren't fatal mistakes. And they also took more ownership over the work because I wasn't there. And then when I was away, that was probably the first time since I was a kid that I had like all this mental time and space that I wasn't just checking boxes and doing all this stuff. And my creative mind really exploded. And I realized I had all these epiphanies and things about the business, which I never would have had if I was just sitting checking those boxes. So I'm a believer that stepping away from work, it doesn't have to be for 4 weeks. It can be for half an hour just to get started. But
I think that is what meditation do for us, right?
Yeah, meditation, getting out, taking walks, getting in nature, playing music. I mean, like whatever helps your brain get flowing in a creative kind of flow state, you will come back and your brain will work better. It just will. You'll just be better at work if you stop working. And that's the part that's really hard for people to wrap their head around. Is like, how will I work better by not working? But I've seen it for myself and I've seen it for many other people. So I believe stepping away from the hustle, you'll come back, especially when you want to innovate. I mean, to be an innovator and just checking boxes all day, mentally, those processes don't go together.
Right.
So it like allows your brain to calm down for a while.
And just work differently. Our brains like to make connections, and the innovation comes when we connect the dots in an unexpected way. So, for example, when we go to sleep and we dream, it's our brain reaching out to different parts to try to make these new connections. And sometimes after dreaming, we have also insights we didn't have before. So that's what I mean. It's not that your brain is not doing anything. You know, when you're resting or meditating or doing a flow state, it's not just turning off a switch. It's doing something different. And it's the different thing that comes back to work and makes you better.
Is that the neuroplasticity?
Well, yeah. I mean, neuroplasticity basically just means that there's a saying, right? If it fires together, it wires together. So that means that brain cells that are active in synchrony will start to get stronger because of the way the structure is. So if you do these creative flow state activities, I believe, your brain is making new connections or strengthening connections that weren't strong. Whereas if you're just email, you're just strengthening the email box, right? You're not really reaching out and doing innovative stuff.
You need to rewire yourself, take a step back, think what happened, what you are doing, and then rewire your brain.
That's why
we need new experiences to do that.
Yeah, and it's hard when you're in the middle of a hustle culture where everybody else has the same assumptions and there's no role model or example to look to see how to do this. It's hard sometimes. And the good thing about being a startup founder is often that you get to kind of be the boss of yourself. I mean, you can challenge your own assumptions. And if you need to go take a walk, like most of the time you can go take a walk. I think for me, that was what I loved about having my own business, was the freedom to do things on my own terms.
So what I got from your insights was like hustle culture is important and it depends, right? But if we do it continuously for a longer period of time, then it becomes toxic. It creates anxiety, it creates panic attacks, like most of the psychological problems that we have. Right.
Yeah, and it probably squashes your innovation and creativity, which is important to most startups.
Yeah, right. So I always wondered, whenever I see these are all important and very serious topics. What is panic attacks and anxiety? These are all serious topics. So from a neuroscience and psychological perspective, what happens inside us when we get these panic attacks or anxiety?
Yeah, I love this question. And it's always great to discuss with people so they can really understand what's happening in their brain and their body. So panic attacks, first of all, are very common. It's probably at least 1 out of 3 people have had a panic attack once in their life. It's very common. Anxiety is probably the most common mental health challenge. Maybe up to 35% of people have had some pretty serious anxiety at some point in their life. So these are very common. And the reason is that the fear response is a normal, healthy response. So if you go back and imagine that we're, ancient humans living in the jungle or something, right? And there's a big lion that jumps out at you. Well, it's good to have a fear response. If you don't have a fear response, you're dead, right? The lion's just going to eat you. So you need to have, it's normal to be fearful of things that are dangerous, right? So when you see the lion, the ancient human body, which is basically the same body we have now, it does 2 things. In the short term, it triggers a very rapid fear response to enable the animal to either, they say, fight or flight. So either to fight that lion or to run away. And so chemicals are triggered very quickly from the brain, and it goes to the whole body to do all the things we need to do to get away, like make your heart go faster, breathe faster, shut down your digestive system, because you don't want to be digesting food while you're trying to fight this animal. Shut down your sexual system, make you warm, bring your body temperature up. Excuse me. So that is a fear response, and it's very normal and healthy to have a fear response. But now what's happening in our modern culture is that the fear response gets triggered in error. So we perceive some sort of danger, which isn't truly a danger. It's not really a lion coming to eat us. It might be an email that looks stressful. but it's the same chemical reaction in our body. And so our body misinterprets something as being very dangerous. So we get all those feelings that would come when we were going to fight a lion. We get hot or sweaty or shaky or tense. We breathe fast. Our heart starts racing. Maybe we even feel a little dizzy. Our stomach, clamps down. So all the feelings of a panic attack, which are in your body, are triggering a fear response in error. So basically, people with panic attacks, your natural, normal fear system is getting triggered in error. And it's getting triggered so often that it's causing you problems in your life. So that's what happens in the short term. And then if you continue to have stressors and fear response long term, there's a second chemical system in the body with cortisol that gets activated. And that's longer term. And that's when, you were saying about burnout and really kind of actually making yourself sick from anxiety. That's that cortisol, that long-term chemical in your body. And it has all sorts of impact. And that's what makes people under stress for a long time actually get sick. So there's kind of these two systems, the short one, which is like the lion jumps at you, you get panicky. And then there's the longer term cortisol over time. So that's what's happening in our body and our brain. And it's really because our modern world, we feel like there are these fears and stressors when perhaps they aren't really as dangerous as we think they are.
Right.
Yeah.
So all these that you said, stressors. So these things are there which creates anxiety and panic attacks inside us. Right.
Yeah, and stress isn't bad. I mean, actually, a little bit of stress is good. A tiny bit of stress helps you grow and develop, right? Because you feel like the stakes are high. And so it helps you and your brain learn things under just a little bit of tension. The problem is when it's too much or too long.
Yeah. Is it like the negative reinforcement for us, for our brain?
It's like we need a little bit, but it's hard to modulate sometimes a little bit, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to make your
Yeah.
workday just have a little bit of stress without having too much stress. So it's kind of like finding that balance, which I think is hard for people.
Yeah. I think it's the same thing, that how much is too much, just like cooking food.
Yeah, because if you had no stress in your life, I don't know, life to me would be kind of boring. I mean, if then I'd be like a robot. If I just sat there and did the same thing every day and I didn't have any challenges, I didn't have any stress, everything was good all the time. To me, that's not a very human existence. I think to be a human, you need a little bit more of a range. It's just the balance. It's always the balance and the modulation that's the hard part.
Right. A little stress is required. Like I have read somewhere that when we are doing something new, right, or something adventurous, that releases adrenaline in our body, right? And when it is released, our brain functions faster and it retains memory. So I read a pretty wicked study that if you want to learn something for life, make your body create adrenaline in it. Sit in.
I think every history student should jump from a building doing skydiving and read the book in between. Like, I'm reading the book, I'm learning everything. Why? I'm skydiving.
Well, the tricky part there is that if you're taking a test, you also do better if you study in the same environment that you take the test. So you'd have to skydive with the test as well to make that one work.
Okay, so does this if I am giving a test as you gave example, so when I'm learning in that same environment, does it help us retain more memory?
If you learn material, like let's say you're going to take a test at school in a room, that you don't normally take your class in. If you can go to that room and study in that room before the actual test, you can do better.
Oh, that's something new.
Yeah. It's your brain. It recognizes the pattern of that setting. And so it's not always possible, but trying to replicate the testing conditions as much as possible. So if you've ever done a prep class for a big test, I had to do a bunch of those, right? They try to replicate the test setting as much as possible so that you can practice under those conditions. And that helps you do much better on the actual test.
Yeah, I cannot relate to that because I never tried studying that much in school. I was always just at the borderline, like I just need to pass. I just need enough to pass the class. Yeah, but that is something that, that worries me that, okay, you can do all that, but there are obviously has to be some way you can, prevent these things from happening. Like there is
Yeah.
meditation, there is physical fitness, like going to gym or going for running. But what else a person can do? Because most founders, startup founders, or people working every day do not have that much time. They
Yes.
cannot do
Yeah.
that much.
So when I was researching this topic for my book, there's kind of like some building blocks that you have to put in place. And like you said, the first step, you have to carve out a little time, because if you don't carve out some time, like you can't really do anything. So the first step is to carve out a little time. And one of the tips or tricks that I recommend based on how your brain works is there's this idea of chunking tasks that are similar in nature. So if you're trying to what people call multitask, which by the way, multitasking is a myth. You can't multitask. You can switch back and forth really, really, really
Okay.
fast. Yeah, you can't multitask. Your brain doesn't do more than one thing at a time. It rapidly shifts back and forth. No, because like let's say you're reading an email and then you get a text message, right? If you read the email, read the text, go to the email, type something, go back to the text, type something, go back to the email, do something else, that's not multitasking. That's switching. You've switched 5 times. And the research shows if you're trying to switch back and forth between 2 things, instead of doing one thing at 100%, you do 2 things at 40%, and you lose 20% to the shift. If you try to do 3 things at the same time, you get 20%, 20%, 20%, and you lose 40%. So now if you have an email, a Slack, and a doorbell ringing or something like that, now you've lost 40% of your brain's ability. So it's real, like multitasking is really a myth and it really harms your productivity. So the solution to that is chunking tasks that are the same. So in our world, this typically means you really got to get a grip on your email and your messaging. So email is done in a chunk of time and then it goes off. And I know people listening are like, that is insane. Like that will never work. But I can tell you it does work. You just have to be on the same page with your team and your boss and tell them, like, let's try this experiment. I heard Dr. Jennie talking about how our brains work and this constant email all day long is killing our productivity. Let's try an experiment.
Yeah.
Let's do email, I don't know, 3 times a day. Pick a number, whatever you want to do. So in the morning, we're going to sit down and do our email, and then we're going to turn it off. And then at lunch, I'm going to turn it on and look at it, and then I'm going to turn it off. And then in the afternoon, before we leave, I'm going to look at it and turn it off.
Right.
And if you chunk the emails together and you don't do other things, you just do email, and then email goes off, and then you do the next thing, and then it goes off. Just try it, do some experiments, but you're going to get so much more out of your brain and you're going to be less exhausted at the end of the day. So carving time by chunking like tasks is something I really recommend. And I know it's very different for most people in their current work culture.
Yeah, specifically because, since I'm working from home and when you're working from home at Teams, you have to be always available. People are always texting you, people are always calling you, and you have to be aware and available all the time. And that's very difficult while you are also working on something at the same time. You have to stay present at the moment, like what someone's going to ask.
So think about what your brain is trying to do in that setting. You're asking it to do something that's kind of impossible. You're asking it to be constantly switching gears. And then you're also asking it to do deep work where you have to really pay attention and focus. And I would say it's actually just not possible. And that's why people feel overwhelmed, because your brain just doesn't work that way. So you need to be able to find times to have deep focus where people aren't distracting you and you're not getting email and you're not getting. So another thing I talk about in the book is like the communication piece is what you're getting at, is like, how do you communicate with people in a remote setting so that you're still available and connected, but you're not like constantly in this email, text, whatever, Slack stream. And this is where you have a conversation with the team and you set expectations together. Like if it's not urgent, you know, if it's by the end of the day kind of thing, send me an email. I'll check my email twice a day. If it's urgent, it really needs something in the next hour between the times I check my email, then here's how you reach me.
Right.
And for me, I've given my cell phone as a text, and I say, if you need to reach me urgently, here, use my text. I will have a phone, or I use a watch. I just keep a watch with me. But if it's not urgent, you know, use email, and I will check it once or twice a day. And it's just agreeing with your team that that's how you're going to do things. Now, if you work with a client like outside of your company, it's a little harder, because then you have to match with their culture and you'd also have to get them. So that's sales jobs. It's a little trickier, I think, but for other jobs that aren't really the sales function, I just challenge people to try it. Just do it for a week. Like tell your team, like, let's just try this for a week and see how it goes.
Absolutely. That's actually really insightful, because that is something we do not think about in the daily basis.
Right.
And that is something you have researched on, so you can actually tell us how that is affecting us.
Yeah, it's just we make assumptions because that's what we're used to, and we see other people around us doing it that way. But it's just an assumption, and maybe it is the right thing for your company. But I just challenge people, like, take a step back, look at the assumption, and do an experiment and see what happens, and you might be surprised.
Right. Absolutely.
So coming back to the previous question, that the prevention methods
Yeah.
for all those psychological problems that we have.
Yeah.
You were trying to say, but we got shifted to another topic in between.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of so what I tried to do, again, when I was trying to figure out how to work virtually, because I wasn't used to it at all when pandemic hit. I was used to going into an office. I went to hospitals. I wasn't used to it either. So I was trying to figure out, you know, what do we know about our human brains? How do we, you know, we all make errors. We're not robots. We're not logical, by the way. We're pretty irrational. We do a lot of human stuff that's very irrational. How do we use that to our advantage to make it, you know, a better work experience? So some of the things I talked about already, where time management, I don't love that word because it's kind of a robot word to me, but it's really like, how do you reclaim your time and how do you think about your time? And then communication. And I mentioned a little bit about that. Some of the other tips and tricks I have in the book are like, our brains really like symbols and faces. So using emojis and symbols is shorthand, and you can communicate a lot of information in a symbol or an emoji. As long as everybody knows what it means, you can cut back on the written word. And the more you can get cut back on the written word, the more you give your brain a break from what we call cognitive overload, because we're all swimming in words right now. There's too many words coming at us all the time. And so another tip or trick is to use symbols. And actually, our brains really like emojis. It turns out that our brains react to an emoji the same way we react to a human face showing an emotion. So tone, you know, using emojis to express your tone. So like if I say, okay, and then I put a smiley face, it means one thing. If I say, okay, and I'm crying face, it means another thing. If I say, okay, and I'm like, grimacing face, that means something else. So the emojis can convey tone in a really nice shorthand way. And then you can use symbols. And an example I give in the book is one of the companies I'm working with right now, we came up with our core values, and then we made a symbol for each of them. And then we put the symbol in Slack as an emoji. So every time on Slack we see somebody doing the core value, we can like put the symbol on it. And it's a really nice way to have a shorthand language for kind of instilling the kind of culture that we want to have. And that's just one example. Another topic, which is very relevant. I mean, we're doing Zoom video call. I know a lot of people just sit on these all day long. That is really, really hard on your brain. So there's some very practical things that you can do to make your day better if you're doing a lot of this. The first thing is that Zoom fatigue or video fatigue is real. It is a real neuroscience phenomenon. It's being studied. And what we know about it is that the way most people use video is exhausting for our brains because it's highly unnatural. So here are a couple examples. I'm sitting more than an arm's distance away from my screen when I'm talking to you, and that is intentional. Most people, we go closer, like that to our screens. And then our brain thinks that we're like inside of our screen. And then we stop moving and our body gets more rigid and we stop doing natural body language, which is not good for our body. And to the other person, it also looks unnatural because we're not moving. So one very simple thing to do is always get some distance from your screen. Another thing that happens is people do video with Hollywood squares, like with all the people, you see like 20 people at the same time.
Right.
So for our brain to see 20 human faces that aren't looking at each other with no relationship signifiers between them, who aren't making direct eye contact with us, who are coming from different directions. I mean, we talked about the lion in the jungle. What if you had like 20 lions, like all coming at you from different like, it's really hard on your brain. So just don't do that.
Yeah, I think that's also because of, the way we grew up. We have always had the conversation where one to another, everyone is in front of us. We can see one person at a time. Do you think that will change with the future generations because they are growing up with this technology that we have right now after growing up? Like they are growing up with that. Do you think that will change with them?
I would say yes, except I have kids who are teenagers who have grown up doing video and they are exhausted too. So, and it was funny when the kids did virtual school during the lockdown time, they turned off their video. And I was like, that's terrible. You should never turn off your video. Your teacher can't see you. I was reprimanding them and it turns out they were right. So best practice is to get on and say hi to everybody and you keep your video on and say hi, and chat for a minute. And then say, okay, now we're going to go off video and maybe we're going to share screen or maybe we're going to do something. And then you go off, let everybody go off video for a while. And then at the end, you can come back on and wrap up. You don't need to be staring at each other the whole time. The only exception to that is sometimes it helps somebody doing a presentation to see the other faces. And in that case, what I would say is turn off your grid view and just let the speaker view on. And turn off your self view. Don't look at yourself. If you put your self view on, it is physically impossible for you not to look at yourself. Your brain will look at yourself no matter what, and that is exhausting. So turn off self view, put on speaker view, or just go off video and come back on at the end. It's not going to resolve the unnatural nature of our current video, but it will definitely help your fatigue. So I recommend that people try that too.
Yeah,
Surely try that from another meeting.
Yeah, I would like to, change the topic a little bit because I have this one question that just came to my mind. Since we are talking about Zoom and all those things, a new trend is coming out, which was like coming out very fast, but now it has slowed down. That is the metaverse. You must have heard about it, right?
Yes.
People are putting on those headsets and going into a virtual reality, trying to create the reality in a virtual realm. So do you think that will prevent this whole issue of having Zoom meetings and all these things? Or it is just another attempt
facade.
to, another facade, another attempt to create the Zoom meeting kind of thing.
I love that question. I actually researched that too. And I tried, as part of the research for the book, I actually tried one of the current systems that has a workspace, where they recreate your desk and your computer and like the office. And I had a colleague, we did a little meeting together. And I mean, it's not perfect right now, obviously. I think there's a couple things that are very promising about using VR to work together like that. If the VR captures our body language, it helps add a layer of communication. So when we were talking in the video, I think it was like from the waist up, it showed our body language and it was able to show kind of how our hands were moving. And that did help. So I think if we can capture what our body is doing, that will help with the communication. So I think that's a positive. Also, the way in the VR you look at each other is a little more natural than it is like this. So I think that's helpful. I also researched, there's a writer called Cal Newport who talks about deep work and the concept of like what we talked about earlier, like getting rid of the distractions so you can do some deep work. And he tried VR for deep work. So he created like a virtual, like a writing cabin in the woods for himself where there was no distractions. And he wrote about his experiences. So I think there's a lot of promise there. I think there's also promise for people who feel scrutinized in the workplace. So typically women feel more scrutinized in the workplace. Typically underrepresented groups feel more scrutinized. So by having an avatar version of yourself, it reduces the scrutiny of your appearance at work. So I think there's some promise for that. Like it might make things a little bit more equal. Where I think it falls short is it doesn't solve the problems of our time. Again, the hustle culture, the communication coming in at us, being in our bodies, like our real physical bodies more. Connecting to things around us. So I don't think it solves for any of that, and it could worsen it. So if we're in VR all day long and we're disconnected from the world we're sitting in, I think that could create some problems too. So I guess that's my answer. It's a mixed bag. I'm eager to try it always. And it could, again, maybe certain meetings, it's really good for like certain kinds of meetings and we use it for one kind of thing, but then we don't use it for another kind of thing.
Right. So really, really great like conversation about this VR stuff. As we, as a nerds, are really interested in that technology stuff. Right. So Abbas and I, like, we were discussing about it, and we had a talk about this. So it was really great to have a conversation with you on that. So let's come to the end conversation of this podcast. Right?
Yep.
So can you tell us more about psychological patterns to become productive? And like, can you tell us some resources we can leverage? As you have also like published a book about it. So can you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. I mentioned, a couple of things we've talked about today are some tips and tricks, like talked about the Zoom, how to do that better, how to chunk emails together. But I would add that really at the end of the day, knowing yourself as a human being really matters. So like almost if you want to put it in tech terms, like what's your user manual? My Dr. Jennie user manual is, for example, that I don't function great after 3 p.m. Like my brain fades when my circadian rhythm dips. So I really don't want to have meetings at 3 because I am kind of irritable and I can't focus, and that's me. That's my user manual. You may be great at 3 p.m. You may be terrible at 8 a.m. Or I might need a lot of quiet time to myself to function well. Or you might be an extrovert and you need a lot of social time. So everybody has a user manual for themselves as a human being. So the psychological patterns that are going to work for you are not going to work for everybody. And this is where, again, the team has to come together and say, what's the work we have to get done, and who are the human beings that we have, and what's the tech we have, and how are we going to combine that to get where we want to go. And it takes that, you have to know thyself, right? So there's like, you really have to kind of know yourself. And you have to know your team, and you have to kind of sit down for a minute and decide what's going to be the best. So if I don't work at 3:00, how do we get around that? Or if somebody else needs a break in the middle of the day, how are we going to do that? And if you sit down and talk to each other, it's actually not as hard as you might think. It sounds like extra work, but getting to know the people you work with as human beings goes a long way, and it helps build trust too. So in terms of resources, yes, I have a new book. This is my debut nonfiction book. It's called, I actually have a copy. It's called Work Smart, Use Your Brain and Behavior to Master the Future of Work. It's available on ebook, paperback, and hardcover on Amazon. That's the best place to buy it. And I will be doing an audiobook for people who like audiobooks and who, if you haven't minded listening to my voice this time, that'll be sometime. It'll be me talking. So that'll happen sometime this summer, probably. And then in terms of other resources you can look at, there's something that was pre-pandemic called the Better Life Toolkit, which is about workplace and how to make it better. There's a woman, Bridget Schulte, who pulled that together. There's an author called Cal Newport I mentioned, who talks about doing deep work. And then for organizational, there's somebody I like called Michael Hyatt, who has a system to kind of organize yourself that I have found really helpful. So those are just a couple of the resources that your listeners might find helpful.
Yes, that was really helpful.
Yeah. And we'll surely, make sure to order the book and read it ourselves. We have been waiting for the paperbook version. Now we know it's available, so we will order it now.
Yeah, and I love to hear people trying experiments in their workplace and then telling me how it went. Like, was it great? Was it terrible? So following me on LinkedIn is the best way to get a hold of me on social media. If you want to reach out and say hi, or say, hey, I tried this thing and you were totally right, or you were totally wrong. And I'm open to being totally wrong as well. So please reach out one way or the other.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. There are very less people I know who are ready to be wrong. And
that's how you learn things. My kids teach me stuff all the time. My kids tell me stuff and I'm like, you know what? You were totally right. And I was totally wrong. Like emojis. I never used emojis. I always thought they were silly. And now I'm like, nope, yeah. you all were totally right.
That's great. That's great.
Awesome. Yeah. So before we end the conversation, we would like you to ask us a question. As we do with all our guests, we will give you a chance to ask a question to us, because we have been asking a lot of questions to you.
I'm so intrigued by what's happening in AI right now, and kind of robot. I always like the idea of a robot helper. So my question would be to you, is there a robot helper out there that doesn't try to take over my brain and hijack my day that I'm not aware of?
Yeah, so I think I can answer it pretty quickly that no, there is not. Not yet. Because see, the most of the robots that are available today in the world are either, able to do very laborious work, like picking up stuff from one point and placing it at another point, or they are able to do warehouse automations, or they are able to clean your house, like those vacuum cleaners, right?
Mm-hmm.
You must have seen those. But there are not enough robots available right now who can actually do the work that you do or anybody else do. They cannot do, laborious chores, that household chores as well. But yes, there is progress in that field as well. Since you must have seen in, like, Tesla is working on creating a robot that is gonna do all the laborious chores that human do at their house. So you don't need to hire someone to clean your house. You don't need to go for grocery shopping and all that. They are in the process. Let's see how it goes. But till now, I don't think that's even possible right now.
Okay. Well, good. I've been trying to keep a lookout for one. So if there's nothing out there yet, that's good. I'll keep looking.
If you're interested, we can do something about it. We can create something.
I would love a helper robot. I was reflecting back. My best helper robot was my Palm Pilot. I don't know if you had Palm Pilots back in the day. It was wonderful. It was like this little organizer. It didn't beep or flash. It didn't do anything. It didn't bother me at all. And it was just I loved that. But that was the last time I had a robot helper that I felt like didn't try to take over my life.
Now we have smartphones to do that.
Yeah.
I have a love-hate relationship with them. That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, we'll surely do that someday too. And thank you, Dr. Jennie Byrne, to be on our podcast. We have been, so blessed to have you here.
Thank you for having me. This was lovely.
It's been a blast.
Guys, today's podcast was really, really insightful. Absolutely. It was such a great conversation that we had with Dr. Jennie Byrne. I don't think anybody has ever told me what she told me today, the topics that we discussed and the main agenda that we had for the podcast. I never heard about it. People always say that if a CEO is there, they have to grind their whole life, work their whole life, don't have to give their mental health enough space to live. And the perspective she presented was so amazing. Exactly. It's such a niche topic that not most of the people are concerned about. But it is very important. Yeah. Right. And her, on that note, and her idea about that 4-week vacation. Right. It was such a unique idea. Seriously. Like, I think that hit us really hard. And I think that was something that we needed as well. And that's why we are here in Goa right now, taking back some time off. We are not stopping ourselves from creating all the conversations that we always have, from creating the content that will help us and help you to grow together. But we needed some time off, so we are there in Goa. So we'll update you on that too. With that note, thank you so much. Yeah. Keep learning. Stay curious.